When the wolf pup suddenly stepped out of the forest and stopped right in front of me, my breath caught in my throat, because I knew in that instant he had come for me. I had been walking along the old path toward the spring, a path I'd taken dozens of times before. Nothing ever really changed there. The same moss-covered stones, the same whisper of birch leaves, the same smell of damp earth that clung to your clothes. And yet, in one heartbeat, everything was different. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. He was so small, his legs awkward, his fur a mix of gray and light brown, like smoke caught in sunlight. A wolf pup, alone. My first reaction wasn't wonder. It was fear. Fear that his mother was somewhere nearby, watching me, ready to defend him. And alongside that fear came something else, something I didn't expect. Pity. He looked too young to be out here alone. I froze, waiting for him to bolt back into the trees. That's what a wild creature should do, run from a human, but he didn't. He just stood there, eyes fixed on me. His gaze wasn't empty or wild, it was deliberate, steady, and the longer he looked, the harder it was to convince myself that this was just some lost animal. Then, without warning, he turned. Not fast, not in fear. He walked a few steps away, then stopped, glancing over his shoulder at me. His eyes caught mine again, and something in that look pulled me forward. Even before I could think, I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was a pup. He didn't want me. He was just wandering, confused. Yet when I hesitated, he sat down right there on the path, as if he was waiting. My chest tightened. Why wasn't he running? Why did I feel as if he was calling me? I took a cautious step. His ears perked up. Another step. He rose to his feet and trotted a little farther down the trail. Again, he stopped. Again, he looked back. I swear to you, it felt like he was leading me. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct told me to turn back. You don't follow wild wolves into the forest. You don't get involved. But there was something about his eyes, something I can't explain, even now. It was as if he had chosen me, as if he needed me. I tried to laugh at myself, to push away the chill creeping up my spine. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he thought I had food. Maybe he was only playing. That's what I wanted to believe. But deep down, I knew better. He looked at me like he was calling me, like I was the one he needed. I should have walked away. I should have turned and gone home. That would have been the sensible, safe choice. But instead, I found myself stepping off the familiar path and into the deeper forest, following a wolf pup as if he were my guide. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the air heavier, my steps slower. Every few yards he'd stop, glance back, and wait. And every time his eyes met mine, it was like a thread pulling me forward. I don't know how long we walked. Maybe minutes, maybe more. Time didn't feel real. My legs moved, but my mind was spinning. What was I doing? Following a wild animal into the woods like some kind of fool? My fear was still there, sharp, cold, but it was tangled now with something else, something harder to admit. A strange kind of awe. Because even though my brain screamed this was madness, my heart told me the opposite. This was no accident. He wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He had come for me. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stopped again. He stood in the middle of the trail, tail still, ears high, staring at me with that same impossible look. For a moment, the forest was so quiet, I could hear my own breathing. I thought he was about to vanish. I thought this was the end of whatever strange moment I had stumbled into. I thought he would dart off into the brush, leaving me alone with my racing heart and my foolish imagination. But nature had something very different in store for me. I don't know what possessed me to keep going, but when that wolf pup trotted ahead again, glancing over his shoulder as though to make sure I followed, my feet moved on their own. The path was no longer the one I knew. Within minutes, the familiar trail had vanished behind me, replaced by narrow tracks I'd never noticed before. How many times had I walked these woods? How many years had I lived by them? And yet here, in the same forest, I felt like I'd stepped into a place I'd never seen. The pup stayed just far enough ahead that I had to keep moving, but not so far that I could lose sight of him. Every time I slowed down, every time fear crept in, and I thought of turning back, he would stop, sit down right in the middle of the path, and fix his eyes on me. Waiting, always waiting. And I kept going. My heart pounded so hard, it felt like it might crack my ribs. The deeper we went, the darker the forest grew. Branches clawed at my jacket, roots snagged my boots, and still I followed. I didn't understand it then, and I barely understand it now, but it was as if I'd surrendered my will to him. I caught myself whispering, "Why am I doing this? What do you want from me?" My own voice sounded strange, small, swallowed up by the woods. The pup didn't answer, of course. He only trotted forward, then paused again, ears twitching, eyes steady. It was uncanny. He wasn't acting like an animal. He was acting like a guide, and that thought, it terrified me even more than if he had bared his teeth. I should have turned back. I should have run. Every story I'd ever heard about wolves screamed in my head. But each time our eyes met, my chest tightened in a way I can't explain. I wasn't just being lured. I was being chosen. Step after step, the forest grew stranger. The ground dipped in places I'd never noticed before, gullies carved deep and hidden beneath tangled brush. Fallen trees crisscrossed the way like barricades, but somehow the pup always found a passage through, and I, clumsy, stumbling, breathless, forced myself after him. The strangest thing was the silence. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels, just my ragged breathing and the soft crunch of his paws on the earth ahead of me. At one point, I stopped. My legs trembled, my chest heaved, and panic surged. What if this was madness? What if he was leading me straight into danger? A den, maybe. His mother waiting, teeth bared, the end of me. But when I stopped, he stopped too. He turned, sat down, and just stared. And God help me, I felt ashamed to break whatever strange bond had formed between us. I took one more step. His ears perked. Another step. He rose, tail flicking once, and continued on, as if reassured. I walked after that pup as though he were a person, I remember thinking, as though he were in charge and I had no choice but to obey. By then, my fear was twined with something else, awe so sharp it almost hurt. I don't know how long we wandered. The sun shifted above the canopy, throwing patches of light that seemed to chase us deeper into shadow. My throat was dry, my palms slick, but still I went on, step by step, unable to break free. And then, at last, the trees opened. Before me stretched a clearing I had never seen before, though I had lived near this forest most of my life. In the center stood something I couldn't believe I'd missed all these years. The dark, slanted roof of a cabin, sagging but still upright, half swallowed by vines. The pup bounded forward, straight toward it. I froze, my breath catching again, my pulse wild. A den, I thought, a trap. He was leading me straight to his home, where his mother would be waiting. I was sure of it. I thought he was leading me to a wolf's lair. But what I found was far more terrifying and far more impossible than anything I could have imagined. The clearing felt wrong the second my boots left the brush. The cabin slouched in the center like a secret the forest had grown around. Roof caved at one corner, windows filmed white with age. I had lived by these woods most of my life and never seen it. I told myself it was just a ruin, a ghost of some hunter's past. I thought that was the end of it, that I'd look, turn around, and go home. But nature had a different plan. The wolf pup shot ahead as if a string pulled him. He ran straight to the door and skidded, claws ticking on the warped boards. Then he set to work, scratching, pawing, pushing with his whole small body. He pressed his nose into the crack, inhaled, and gave a short, choked whine that tightened the skin on my arms. He threw his head back and howled. The sound was thin and high, and it climbed straight into my chest. I froze. In the backwoods, a howl is never nothing. It can mean warning. It can mean grief. It can mean trouble you cannot see yet. My breath stuck halfway out. I listened for an answer, for the heavy pad of a mother's steps, for branches shifting with something bigger than me. Nothing. Only that single note stretching into silence until even the trees seemed to hold their breath. He looked at me then. No wild glare, no fear. A steady, pleading look. He pawed at the door again, then at my boot, then back to the door, as if to say, "Do it. Help." My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. I do not know why his eyes had that power over me, but they did. He looked at me like I was his own. I stepped forward. The smell hit first, leaking through the cracks, wet wood, old smoke, rot, and something sweet that turned my tongue bitter. I called out, my voice small and shaky, "Hello? Anyone in there?" The words sank into the cabin and did not come back. The pup circled, frantic. He darted to a window and rose on his hind legs, paws tapping the fogged pane, then returned to the door and pressed one ear to the gap, listening, as if he belonged to whoever was inside. That was the thing that twisted my stomach, his certainty. He was not guessing. He knew. The door was swollen shut. I wrapped my sleeve around my hand and tried the handle. It groaned but held. Every part of me said, "Leave. This is not yours. Walk away before something larger than you decides you are trespassing." But the pup planted himself between me and the path, sat down, and stared. It was a look I would have recognized from a person. Quiet insistence, a kind of trust that feels heavy when you have not earned it. "Okay," I whispered, to him or to myself, I do not know. "Okay." I found a deadfall branch thick as my wrist and wedged it under the handle. Wood creaked like a wounded thing. The hinges answered with a rusty bark that lifted every hair on my arms. I stopped, listening again for the forest to change, for the air to move in that way it does when a predator closes in. Nothing, only my pulse and the pup's fast breathing. I pried harder. The latch surrendered with a pop that echoed too loud. The door shivered and opened a hand's width, then stuck. A colder breath slid out as if the cabin exhaled. I slid my fingers into the gap, found splinters and damp, and worked it wider. Darkness pooled inside. I raised my phone and tapped the light, a weak square cutting into the gloom. Dust hung like fog. The beam found the edge of a table, a tin mug on its side, a coat hook with a rotted strap hanging from it. The floorboards dipped in places, gray with mold. In one corner, a heap of blankets slumped like a person fallen asleep in the wrong century. The pup shouldered past my leg, stopped with his nose at the threshold, and trembled. He did not cross. He whined, barely a sound, then went quiet, eyes on me again. "Go on," his look said. "Please." I stepped in. The floor answered with a tired sigh. The smell was thicker now, mildew, mouse, that sweet rot edging into something metallic I did not want to name. My light drifted to the stove, a squat iron thing with its mouth open, ash spilled like gray snow. A cracked plate leaned against its side. I touched it without meaning to, as if proof mattered. "Hello?" I tried again, louder. "I mean no harm. I'm here to help." The words were a stranger's in my mouth, too brave for how my knees felt. Nothing. I pushed the door wider to let in more day. The pup crept one paw over the threshold, then another, then stopped again, nose high, drawing in the air like a letter he could read. He lifted his gaze to mine and held it until I felt the message land inside me like a weight, Do not leave. I edged toward the heap in the corner. The blankets were wool, stiff with damp. I kept telling myself I would find only trash, a nest of mice, a hollow log brought in for kindling and forgotten. My light trembled. I tried to steady my hand and failed. For a second, there was nothing. Only dust, and my own shallow breaths, and the tiny tick of something dripping somewhere behind the stove. The heap did not move. The cabin was just a cabin, empty and old and better left alone. I thought there was no one inside. But then, from beneath those blankets, came the faintest rustle, dry and slow, and a sound so small it barely qualified as a voice, a rasp of air that caught and broke, a human breath torn thin. The blood in my veins went cold. The pup's ears snapped forward. He stepped past me without fear, pressed his nose to the wool, and whined, a soft, urgent sound that felt like a hand on my shoulder. And in that instant, I knew. Whatever lay under there, this little wolf had brought me to it for a reason I could not yet understand. I eased the blanket back, and a hand slid into view, thin, gray with dirt. The nails cracked and blew at the beds. My light shook. The pup pressed in beside me, nose working, tail held low like he understood the weight of this moment. I pulled the wool farther, and a face appeared, an older man, cheeks hollowed, lips split, beard matted to his neck. His eyes were closed, but there was life there, the shallow rise of his chest, the tiny catch of breath like a match trying to hold a flame. I whispered, "Hey, can you hear me?" The word scraped my throat. I touched his shoulder through his jacket. The fabric was damp and cold. He flinched, a twitch more felt than seen. The pup stepped closer and, with the gentlest certainty, licked the man's hand. Not a curious lick, not a greedy one, a greeting, as if he knew him, as if he had been here before and this was their routine. The man's fingers tried to curl, slow as winter sap, and a sound escaped him, a weak, dry thank you, without words. I didn't know whether to cry or pray. I had come to a ruined cabin following a wild animal, and now I knelt over a stranger who was barely holding on. I kept saying, you're okay, I'm here," as if saying it could make it true. My hands moved before my mind caught up. Jacket off, rolled tight to prop his head, water bottle uncapped, a damp corner of my sleeve pressed to his lips. He swallowed once, twice, like each drop was a test. "Easy," I told him, "small sips." I tore a strip from the blanket's edge to wipe his mouth. The metal taste in the air clung to my tongue. My phone read no service, a small lie that felt like a door shutting. I should have panicked. Instead, I looked at the pup. He stood like a little sentry, eyes flicking between us, steady and sure. He looked at me as if to say, "Keep going." The man's eyelids twitched. Then he found me, two pale eyes rolling open like windows unstuck. They were clouded with pain and still, beneath it, so human it hurt to see. He tried to speak and only managed a rasp. I leaned close. "Don't talk. Save your strength." He shook his head the tiniest bit, stubborn even here, even now. His gaze slid to the pup. For a breath he simply looked, and then his eyes filled, not with fear, with something deeper, recognition, relief, a wild gratitude that made my own vision blur. The pup lowered his head and pressed his nose to that cracked hand again, and I swear to you, he waited. He waited for thanks. I stood there not believing my own eyes. A wolf saved a person. I found a half-rotted cupboard and yanked it open. A tin cup, a rag, a small jar with something long turned to dust. Nothing useful. I went back, knelt, and eased another trickle of water into the man's mouth. He coughed, grimaced, and swallowed again, this time on his own. The color in his cheeks was still wrong, but a thread of life tugged a little stronger. "Food?" he croaked. The word was a ghost. "Not yet," I said. "Water first." I checked his hands, his wrists, the line of his ribs beneath the jacket. No obvious breaks, only the sharp edges of a body gone too long without enough. I pressed his fingers to my pulse point. "Stay with me," I said. "Feel that? We're still here." The pup paced 2 steps, then trotted to the doorway, then back, restless in a way that meant purpose, not fear. He nosed at the man's jacket pocket and whined, turned to me, then back to the pocket. I slipped my fingers in and found a crushed paper, a stick of gum, a bent key, and something else, hard, smooth, the size of a walnut, a pebble, number A button, the kind from an old coat. It meant nothing to me then. It would mean everything later. I lifted the cup again. Small sip. He took it, and this time his eyes stayed on mine while he drank, like he was weighing me, deciding if he could hand himself over to a stranger in a place where help should not have arrived. Outside, the light shifted. A cold draft wandered through the door, carrying the forest with it, wet leaves, pine, the thin thread of smoke from some far-off fire. I wrapped my jacket tighter around his shoulders and slid closer to give him what warmth I had. My heart pounded hard enough to make me dizzy, but under the fear, something steadier had taken root. The shock was still there. So was a single clean certainty. I was not alone in this. The little wolf had seen to that. The man licked his lips. "How long?" he asked, voice torn. "I don't know," I said, "but not any longer." He blinked, a slow, grateful blink that undid me. Tears burned before I could stop them. I swiped them with the back of my hand and saw the pup watching me, head tilted, like he was making sure I understood who deserved the credit. I did. If your heart is holding its breath right now, you understand. Subscribe. This is where we tell the true stories nature hides. I thought that was the climax, the moment the story would crest and settle. I thought I had seen the miracle, and the rest would be simple. Water, warmth, a walk back out, a call for help when the signal returned. I thought the pup's work was done, but he was not finished. I thought the next step was simple. Keep him warm, keep him awake, wait for a flicker of cell service. But the pup had other plans. He gave the man's hand one last careful lick, then trotted to the doorway, glanced back at me, and slipped outside. When I didn't move, he returned, brushed my boot with his shoulder, and darted out again, insistent, almost impatient. "Stay with me," I told the man, tucking my jacket tighter around him. "I'll be right here." His eyes tracked mine, trusting me because he had no other choice. The pup gave a small sound from the threshold, a soft push of breath that felt like a summons. I went. Behind the cabin, the ground dipped into a narrow pocket of shade. The pup led me straight there, tail low, head level, purposeful. He nosed through damp leaves, pawed twice, and uncovered a small, miserable treasure, a cluster of dark berries mashed flat, a strip of rabbit hide, 3 pale bones stacked like kindling. A cache, not random, collected. He picked up the strip of hide, carried it to the cabin door, and laid it carefully on the threshold as if placing an offering. Then he looked up at me. My hands began to shake. I pressed them to my ribs to steady myself and failed. "He's been feeding him," I whispered into the cold air, as if the trees themselves needed to hear it. He fed him. A wolf fed a man. I couldn't believe it. He was just a pup, and yet none of this was clumsy or accidental. I followed him back to the dip where he pawed again and uncovered a rotten mushroom he ignored, then a flattened wad of grass that smelled faintly sweet. He sniffed it, sneezed, and buried it back, discerning, like he knew what helped and what hurt. One by one, he collected the things that could nourish and carried them to the door as if he'd done it a dozen times. A wave of fear moved through me, the old hard kind that says wild is wild and always will be. I was in its house, on its terms. What was I doing judging any of this with my small human rules? But the fear broke against something gentler, a shock that felt like gratitude. The pup wasn't acting out of hunger or play. He was doing what any decent soul would do when it finds another barely breathing. He circled suddenly, nose high, then bounded to a fallen branch where a dented tin pot lay half hidden. He nudged it with his muzzle, pushed, stopped, and looked at me. I picked it up. Rust bit my palm. I understood. Water. He couldn't carry it, but he could show me what they had used before. "I see it," I said. "I see you." My voice shook. He blinked, satisfied, then trotted ahead down a faint track to a seep where cold water bled out of the hillside and threaded over stones. The way there was worn in a manner I would have missed if I hadn't been led. Tiny paw prints, some small, some larger, scored into the mud and hardened by old sun. The sight hollowed me out and filled me at the same time. I scooped the pot full, sloshed most, and still hurried like I was trying to outrun what I felt. At the door, the pup stood back to let me pass, then followed me in and settled by the man's elbow as if taking attendance. The man sipped, coughed, sipped again, and let his head rest heavier against my rolled jacket. When I glanced down, I saw the pup's gaze pinned to his face, waiting for the smallest sign of relief, almost proud. I wanted to say the right thing, and there were no right words. "You're not alone," I managed. "He's been looking after you." The man's eyes slid to the threshold where the offerings lay. Tears gathered and didn't fall. His mouth moved. No sound came out, just a shape. "Thank you," to the animal, not me. I stepped back into the light to breathe. The line between fear and awe had blurred so completely I couldn't find it anymore. I had always respected the forest's danger. I had never expected its mercy to look like this. My mind kept throwing up the same picture, the little wolf at dawn and dusk, trotting through the trees with a jaw full of berries or a scrap of meat, placing it on the threshold and waiting for a hand to move. It undid me. He brushed past my knee again, leading me back to the dip, to a second cache I hadn't seen. This one held a cracked eggshell, a feather stuck to it, and a piece of something too far gone to name. He pawed it, hesitated, and left it. He had learned what the man would take. He had learned what not to bring. I don't know where he learned any of it. At the edge of the clearing, the mud held larger, older prints beneath the pups, deeper ovals, steady, deliberate. I stared at them, only a breath before looking away, pretending I hadn't seen. My skin remembered every story I'd ever heard and tried to put a knife into my gratitude. But when I turned, the pup was there, close, calm, his head tipped just so, as if to say, "You're safe, for now, with me." I brought more water. I soaked the corner of a rag and dabbed the man's cracked lips. His eyes found the pup again. They filled until they shone. The pup's ears softened. He waited, patient as a nurse, for the smallest nod of thanks. And when it came, just a breath of movement, his tail thumped once against the floor. "He fed him," I said out loud, to no one and everything. "A wolf fed a man." The words felt too big for the room, and still not big enough. In that moment, I thought I understood the whole story. I decided it was simple after all. A wild creature had stumbled on a broken human and saved him in the only way it could: food, water, a call for help that somehow found me. I thought the animal had simply rescued him. But the truth waiting for me just beyond the tree line would turn everything I believed, about fear, about kin, about who owes what to whom, inside out. I told myself I had done what I could. Water, warmth, a little strength coaxed back into a failing body. If I could reach a signal, help would come. I stood, wiped my hands on my jeans, and took a step toward the path. The pup moved like a hinge closing. He slipped in front of me and sat, square in the way, eyes on mine. I shifted left. He shifted left. I tried to ease past on the right. He was there first, silent, steady, the tiniest shake of his head as if to say, "Not yet." "I have to go," I whispered. "He needs more than I can give." The pup didn't growl. He didn't threaten. He only looked at me, and the look was so clear it hurt. "Stay." My throat tightened. I glanced back at the man. His breath was still shallow but more certain now, his hands less rigid. I told myself I would wait a little longer, just a little, then try again. I set more water within reach. I found a dry scrap of curtain and rolled it for a pillow. The pup stayed by the door, a sentry with a child's body and an old purpose. The forest changed then, in that way you can feel before you can name. The light thinned, the air cooled. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a twig snapped, not by accident. The pup went still. His ears lifted. He didn't look at me this time. He looked past me, through me, into the trees. I knew what was coming. Every story I'd ever heard rose at once like a flock and beat at my ribs. I put my body between the man and the doorway without thinking. My hands trembled. My mouth went dry. I braced for the shape I feared and desired in equal measure. She stepped out of the brush as if the forest had decided to make a promise visible, larger than the pup by a life, gray threaded with darker shadow, ribs strong, eyes bright and terribly calm. The mother, the pup didn't hide. He ran to her, small body low, tail soft, and pressed his face to her muzzle. They touched once, twice, a greeting without sound. She smelled him, smelled the air, and lifted her head toward the cabin. I felt every nerve wait for the moment her gaze would land on me like a weight. It did, and it wasn't a threat. She saw me. She held me there with her eyes, and, for a long breath, nothing moved. I was a trespasser. I was a helper. I was both. And then something in her changed. Not softened exactly, not tamed, but measured. She looked at me the way a mother looks, not an enemy, a keeper. She turned her head and picked up what she carried, a piece of fresh meat, red and clean, a strip from something taken not long ago. She walked toward the cabin with steps that were neither fearful nor bold, only certain. I could feel my heart in my mouth. If she rushed, if she flinched, if I did anything wrong. She did not rush. She crossed the clearing with quiet purpose, came to the threshold, and set the meat on the boards, just inside the door, close enough that the man could reach it if he gathered himself. Then she stepped back and stood very still. Behind me, the man saw. His eyes widened, then they filled, simple as water finding a dish. His lips moved around a sound that would not come. The pup looked between them both as if taking attendance, as if this was the exchange he'd been building toward all along. For a handful of heartbeats, that was all there was. A wild mother laying food at a stranger's feet, a stranger crying without shame, a small wolf holding the world together with his stare. I thought foolishly that this was the end of it, the proof and the goodbye, the kind of moment a person carries for the rest of her life and tells only once. I thought this was the end of the story. But nature was not done with me. The mother wolf's ears tipped at some private sound. She glanced toward the trees and back to me as if measuring if I would bolt. I did not. I couldn't. The pup made a small, insistent grunt and nudged the tin pot I had used for water with his paw. The mother followed the motion, lowered her head to the lip of the pot, and nudged it too, deliberate, precise, pushing it a finger's width toward me. Not hungry, not begging, helping. I swallowed hard. "I see you," I said, voice thin. "I see what you're doing." The words were too small, and still they seemed to matter. The mother's tail lifted and fell once, a quiet acknowledgement. The old man reached, faltered, reached again. I moved to steady him, kept my body small, my hands slow. The mother did not tense. She watched both of us, as if holding the space open with her gaze. Every story I had about wolves felt like a stack of dry twigs, and this moment was the match. Wild is wild, I thought, and yet here I was, welcomed enough to breathe. The pup stepped back to his mother's side and pressed himself against her foreleg, a child returning to the base of the world. She bent and touched the top of his head, a gesture so ordinary my eyes stung. Then she lifted her face and looked past me to the man, long and steady, her nose testing the air for pain, for fear, for whatever a creature like her knows that I do not. I waited for her to turn away, to disappear into the trees and take the pup with her. That would have been mercy enough, that would have been miracle enough, but she didn't turn. Without hurry, without drama, the mother wolf stepped forward and put one paw on the threshold, then another, and crossed into the dim of the cabin. She moved around me like water finding its line, and lay down near the man's feet, not touching, close enough to share breath. I could not make sense of it. I could only stand there, shaking, every rule I had about what is and isn't possible slipping like bark in rain. I told myself again that this must be the ending, the last note of a story that would haunt me until I died. And then, as the pup settled beside her and the man's hand hovered, uncertain, above their fur, something happened that I still cannot explain. What happened next is the part I still can't explain. The old man's hand hovered above the mother's fur, shaking. She didn't flinch. She didn't bare a tooth. She lifted her head a little, as if offering herself, and the pup slid closer until his small body was a warm brace against her shoulder. I watched the man's fingers land, light as a moth, and stay. His breath steadied. The room felt different, quieter, held, like something bigger than me had stepped in and taken over. He pushed himself up by inches. I reached to help, but the mother's eyes were on me, calm and measuring, and I let the moment be his. He made it to an elbow, then to a sit, ribs hitching. His mouth worked. The first sound was only air. The second was a word. "They brought me back to life," he whispered. It didn't sound dramatic. It sounded true. It ran through me like cold water. I thought of the pup's caches behind the cabin, the nudged pot by the spring, the meat set on the threshold as neat as a plate at a table. I thought of the days and nights those animals must have kept watch while no one else did. I felt my throat close around the size of it. The pup turned his face to me then, amber eyes steady and impossibly clear. He didn't blink. He didn't ask. He only looked, and in that look was a human kind of trust that unmade me. He looked at me like I was his own, and I cried. Tears came without heat, quiet and clean. I wiped them with the heel of my hand, ashamed and not ashamed at all. I had always told myself I respected wild things, that I kept my distance out of wisdom, but respect had nothing to do with what I felt right then. It was something closer to gratitude and guilt knotted together. These animals had done what people should have done. They had fed him. They had watched him. They had waited for help, and, when help did not come, they became it. The old man's fingers slid from fur to floor. He managed another sip of water, then a tiny bite of meat. He chewed slow, eyes half closed, the way you do when each motion counts. The mother wolf lowered her head to the boards and let out a breath that was almost a sigh. The pup watched the man's throat move and, when he swallowed, thumped his tail once and went still again, like he was counting. "I was lost," the man said after a long time, words frayed but sure. Storm took the trail, fell, couldn't walk. Then, him. He tipped his chin toward the pup. Kept coming, morning, night. He swallowed. She, water. He nodded at the mother, stayed close, sang once. His eyes flicked to mine, wet and bright. so I wouldn't be afraid of the dark. My chest hurt like I'd been running. I turned my face toward the door for air and saw the clearing held steady, the trees making a simple ring, as if this had always been a place meant for mercy. I tried my phone again out of habit. No bars. The world outside could wait one more hour. The pup shifted, toes clicking softly. He moved to the old man's side and tucked his chin under the man's wrist, lifting it the smallest amount, an invitation, a prompt. The man's hand landed on that small, warm head. I could feel the weight of it from where I stood. The mother's eyes found mine then, and for one long second, I was seen, not as a threat, not as a savior, as another creature being asked to hold her part of the work. "I'll get him out," I whispered, surprised to hear my own promise before I had made the plan. "I'll find a way." The mother blinked once, slow. The pup's ears softened. The man smiled with only one corner of his mouth, and that was somehow worse than if he had wept again. I set to the small tasks my hands could bear. I tightened my jacket around the man's shoulders. I broke the meat into thin slivers and let him choose. I warmed water with my breath and patience. The pup watched everything. If I moved too fast, he stilled me with a look. If I moved too slow, he nudged my boot, gentle, firm, like a nurse with a stubborn patient. There were moments of fear threaded through the quiet. A branch cracked outside, and my heart lurched. The mother only turned an ear. Wind carried a scent I could not name. The pup tasted it and dismissed it with a small sneeze. Every time I forgot where I was, I remembered again. A cabin, a man, a family of wolves making room for a human in their circle without asking for permission or praise. After a time that could have been minutes or an hour, the old man's color shifted from the terrible gray of the wood's edge to something warmer. He leaned back, exhausted but present, and the lines around his mouth eased. He looked at the meat he hadn't finished and pushed it with a stubborn pride toward the threshold as if returning a favor. The mother did not take it until his hand fell away. Then she lifted it, careful as a person would lift a gift, and set it aside. I thought that was the last note, the gentle closing of a door I would hear in my chest for the rest of my life. I thought we would sleep a little, wake to a scrap of signal, and walk out under a pale, decent sky. I thought this would be my last meeting with them, a miracle sealed and done. But the forest had a farewell of its own, and it wasn't gentle. It was an answer I didn't know I'd asked for, a kind of proof that felt like a hand laid on my shoulder from a world I had no right to enter. Dusk thinned the light until the cabin felt like a held breath. The old man dozed in brief, shallow drops of sleep, waking with a start and then settling again when his hand found the pup's neck. The mother lay near his feet, eyes half-lidded, hearing everything I could not. Then, as if some clock I couldn't see struck a quiet hour, she rose. She touched the pup's ear with her nose, and he stood. No sound, no command, just certainty. She stepped to the door and paused, measuring the wind, reading the clearing the way I might read a page. The pup looked at the man one last time, then at me. For a heartbeat I thought he would beg or cling or turn away. He did none of that. He gave me that steady human look, the one that had led me here, and then he looked past me, to the trees, to his life. He turned and went with his mother. They walked into the forest without a single glance back. I don't know why that broke me. Maybe because I wanted a goodbye. Maybe because I had grown used to the idea that I mattered to him in some private way. But their leaving like that, calm, clean, felt like a lesson I had not asked for and suddenly could not live without. They were not mine. They were never mine. They had done their work, and now they trusted me to do mine. The old man stirred. I wiped my face and knelt beside him. He blinked awake, searching for what had changed. He saw the empty doorway, and something complicated crossed his face, loss and relief braided together. He swallowed and reached for my wrist. "Thank you," he whispered, and I shook my head, ready to tell him it wasn't me. He beat me to it. "No," he said, voice thin but fierce. "Them, the wolves, saved my soul." The words landed in me like a bell. Not my life, my soul. I believed him the moment he said it. I think I had believed it before he did. I helped him drink. I tucked the jacket closer. His eyes drifted to the threshold where the last strip of meat had been, the clean board where it had rested like an offering at an altar. He watched the empty space for a long time, as if to brand it into memory. I let him. I needed it burned into mine, too. Outside, a wind shifted through the birches and made a sound like fabric being folded. I stepped into the doorway to breathe air that wasn't full of rot and iron. The clearing looked ordinary again, the way miracles always do once they've passed. I listened for a howl and told myself I wouldn't hear one. I told myself wild things don't send postcards. From somewhere deep in the trees came a single low note, more hum than cry. It rose, held and fell until it threaded into the branches and disappeared. It wasn't for fear or warning. It wasn't even a call. It sounded like a simple answer. We are here, and we were here, and now we go. I stood very still. My hands shook, and not from cold. My mind reached for words and came up empty. I had lived my whole life thinking I knew what wild meant. Teeth, distance, rules that started and ended with hunger. I had been afraid for the right reasons and also for the wrong ones. Fear had kept me careful. It had never made me grateful. Not like this. I went back inside. The man watched me the way people watch someone who has just returned from a place they can't follow. His eyes were clearer now. He reached for my hand and squeezed, a dry, stubborn pressure that said he was still in there. I squeezed back and tried to smile. "Rest," I said. "We'll go when the light comes." He nodded, and his eyes slid closed, and for the first time since I had pulled back the blanket, I let myself sit on the floor and lean my head against the wall. There, in the dim, the small details anchored themselves whether I wanted them or not. The dented pot by the door, the line of paw prints in drying mud, the soft depression where the mother had rested, the tiny nick on the pup's ear I hadn't noticed until he was already gone. The button I had found in the man's pocket pressed against my thigh where I had slipped it without thinking. It felt heavier than it should, as if it belonged to the story itself and not to a coat. I knew I would never be able to tell this in a way anyone would believe. I could talk about the meat on the threshold and the water at the seep and the little caches behind the cabin. I could say I saw a pup feed a man and a mother lay down fear like an old coat. I could swear on anything that they looked at me not as a threat, but as a keeper. People would nod and smile and call it beautiful and change the subject. Or they would doubt. Or they would decide I had made it prettier than it was. So I decided I would carry it the way you carry a secret that isn't yours to spend. I would get the old man out. I would come back, if I could, and leave something at that door, even if no one was there to take it. I would keep my part. I thought I would walk away and let time do its work and file the sharp edges down. I thought the world would crowd back in and the forest would return to being a background. I thought that by winter this would become a story I had to pull at like a stubborn knot to feel anything at all. I thought I would forget. But this story did not let go. It stayed in my bones and behind my eyes and in the space just beneath my ribs. It waited in the quiet of my house and in the clatter of my days. And when I returned, because of course I returned, the forest gave me a farewell I still cannot speak of without my hands shaking. I waited until he was safe before I went back. The morning after the wolves left, a ranger and I rigged a walking sling from saplings and shirts and we inched the old man out under a pale sky that felt like the world starting over. Weeks later, after a hospital bed, after a name, after I learned he'd wandered off the trail in a storm and lost everything but breath, I drove to the forest alone with a thermos, a bag of food, and the dented tin pot in the passenger seat. The button I'd found in his pocket rode in my jacket. I didn't know why I brought it. I only knew I couldn't leave it in a drawer. By the time I parked at the trailhead, the air had that thin, metallic clarity that comes when the seasons change. The path inhaled me. I walked the way the pup had taught me, eyes low, heart high, trusting my feet to find a route I still could not see on a map. Every few minutes I stopped and listened the way the mother had, my head turned as if I could read wind. It felt foolish and right at the same time. The clearing opened where it had always been, except it wasn't the same place anymore. For a second my mind refused it, tried to overlay the memory, door, sagging roof, stove with its iron mouth. But the cabin had given up. The roof had finally fallen. The front wall had slipped. The door itself lay on its side like a bone picked clean. Vines had already begun their slow work. It looked less like a ruin than a swallowed thing. My breath stuttered. I told myself this was what time did. It ate. It didn't mean anything. It didn't unmake what had happened here. Still, a single, useless thought rang inside me. I am too late. I set the bag down on what had once been the threshold. It scraped the dirt and released the smallest puff of dust, and that tiny sound broke the spell. I noticed what the forest had left precise and untouched, the flat stone that had been the step, a circle of hard-packed earth where bodies had rested, the faint groove where my own knees had pressed the floorboards, proof in negative. I thought the forest had erased them, and then I saw the prints. They were shallow but clear in a band of damp earth just beyond the fallen wall, a big oval pad with 4 strong toes, and beside it, a smaller copy, edges sharp where the soil had held its shape. They walked together, side by side, right through the place where the door had been, then turned and disappeared toward the trees. The larger set overlapped the smaller in a dozen spots, as if the mother had nudged her child closer and closer to her own path until they moved like one animal. Everything inside me went cold and bright. Goosebumps rose so fast it hurt. My eyes burned, not from grief, not exactly, but from the sudden, impossible intimacy of recognition. It was them, not a story I made to survive the telling, not a kindness I imagined because I needed the world to be gentler than it is. It was them. I crouched and put my hand over the small track. My fingers were too big to fit. A whole life could fall through that gap between my palm and the earth, and still the print would hold. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally stood, my legs shook. I told myself this was enough, a set of marks in mud to certify a miracle. I told myself I didn't need more. I picked up the dented pot from where I had set it and turned to go. The light caught on something small in the dirt, and the world tilted. It was the button. The same dull, smooth circle I'd taken from the old man's pocket, set dead center on the flat threshold stone, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. It wasn't where I had carried it, buried in my jacket. It was here, waiting, as if the forest had made a deal with gravity and memory behind my back. I pressed my fingers to my chest, jacket, pocket, empty. My stomach dropped, my throat closed, my skin prickled all at once. There were so many ways to explain it, that meant nothing. I could have dropped it the day I carried him out. It could have rolled from a seam. 100 small accidents could have conspired to set it exactly where a human hand would choose. My mind lined them up, ready to argue me back into safety. But beside the little disc, a single dark berry had been pressed into the stone until it bled a small, perfect stain. And around them, neat as a stitched hem, 3 pale bones lay in a crooked half-moon. I couldn't breathe. Tears came hard and fast. My hands shook so violently the tin pot chimed. The arrangement was simple, clumsy even, and it undid me more completely than the howl in the doorway had. A human thing and a wild thing set side by side, like words in a language I had no right to speak. I sank to my knees and the cold climbed through my jeans. The air felt electric, thin as glass. I kept thinking it was real, and also I am inside a dream, and also I am being told something and I might not be worthy of it. The truth was all three at once. A wind came through and moved the vines like a slow hand smoothing a bed. I listened without knowing what for. No howl, no crack of branch, only my pulse, reckless and huge, and the steady breath of the trees. I laid the pot upright where the door had been and poured water from the thermos until it held a small, bright mirror of sky. I set the bag of food beside it and arranged nothing further. The forest had a better sense of ceremony than I did. For a long time I stood there with my hand on the flat stone, crying with that strange, quiet kind of crying that is mostly breath. My mind offered me a dozen ways to take it back in, to make it small enough to fit in a story a person would believe. I let them pass like birds I couldn't name. I picked up the button and turned it once in my fingers, then set it back exactly where it had been. It wasn't mine to take. It had found its place. On the way out, I walked slower because my body had to relearn distance after closeness. Every trunk felt like a person I should nod to. Every shadow felt like a door I had been through before and might never be allowed to pass again. At the trailhead, I stopped with my hands on the hood of the car and shook so hard my keys sang against the metal. Goosebumps rose again and again as if my skin kept remembering on a loop. The tears didn't stop. I let them. I knew, standing there with the smell of cooling engine and pine mixing in the air, that I would never tell this in a way anyone would fully believe. I could bring them to the flat stone and show them a circle of bones and a berry stain and a button that shouldn't have been where it was. I could lead them along the path and point to the faint places where paws had pressed the earth and the earth had kept their shape. They would smile. They would say it was beautiful. They would say it was lucky. They would change the subject. I would nod, because some things are not for explaining. I drove home in silence. That night, and many nights after, I woke with my heart racing and had to press my palm to my chest to remind it that I was not still in the cabin, breathing rot and iron and wonder. I'd stand at the kitchen sink and feel the room tilt with the memory of a pup staring straight into me until I understood who he thought I was. The feeling never faded. It became part of the way my body keeps time. People ask what I learned, and I say the smallest true thing I can say. I learned to look. I learned to be looked at. I learned that mercy wears teeth and fur and leaves offerings on a stone when no one is watching. This doesn't happen, but I saw it myself, and since then I know animals are wiser than we are. They remember kindness and return it. If you also believe that animals remember kindness, right, we are not alone in this world.